Welcome to Inside the Issues. My name is Jeff Bergman, and on behalf of the Empty Nesters, I want to welcome all of you to a program that runs occasionally whenever we feel the urge to, we see issues that we really want to deal with. Before we get into what the program's really all about tonight, if I can, a couple of things. No food or drink. No food or drink in the auditorium, please, in the chapel. The presentation will run for about 45 minutes, after which we'll have a discussion session, Q&A, if you would, and everybody will have a chance. The program itself tonight is being recorded. It's not being streamed, it's being recorded. So someday it may be on the Temple website. We'll see, but it is. It's just FYI. And last but certainly not least, if you could turn off or silence your cell phones. I didn't see anybody move. And I know some of you are in need of help. Anyway, so before we get into the program, let me introduce our new rabbi, Rabbi Eliana Fischel, and to say a few words to us. Rabbi?
Hi, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here with you all. My name is Rabbi Eliana Fischel. I'm the newest addition to the clergy team here at Washington Hebrew, and just wanted to welcome everybody on behalf of the clergy. And I'm actually going to leave all of the immigration conversation to our great speaker that we're going to have, including the Jewish basis for this conversation. She has it down, so we're good there. But it'd be remiss of me not to give a little something. So this week's Parsha, we start the book of Deuteronomy. And the first verse of the book says that Moses spoke to Kol Yisrael, to all of Israel. And I just think that conversations like this is why I love working in a synagogue, and actually a lot of religious institutions, because we address Kol Yisrael, right? Everybody. It's a place to come, which is so rare in our world, that's so polarized, that we have a place here to be able to have hard conversations where we're able to voice differing opinions, where we're able to see different sides and have those conversations respectfully and in a way that challenges us, or else why are we here, right? So I think that that's something that is deeply, deeply Jewish and deeply wonderful that we're able to participate in this evening. It's holy work. So that is my piece. It's wonderful to be here with all of you, and I'm excited to hear all of your voices, and certainly the voice of the Honorable Joan Churchill. Thank you.
So if I can, the Inside the Issues program was created in response to, we have an awful lot of people with an awful lot of talent in the congregation, and we wanted to tap into that talent with people who know the issues that you see on the front pages, who you will not see on Meet the Press or a host of other programs, who could bring their real-world experience to these kinds of discussions. And we cover all sorts of topics, from the Middle East to social issues to Jewish issues to issues like immigration. We've had one discussion before about immigration, and clearly, unless you've I trust everybody has noticed that immigration has been a giant issue across our southern border especially, and you can't open the paper, although this week you can open the paper and not see that on the headline. It's on page 2 now, which I heard a joke tonight that if Putin comes, he better not bring his children because they'll be separated at the border. And therein lies a piece of the problem. So we turn to a member of the congregation, Joan Churchill, to give us some insights and perspective on what's going on. A little about Joan. She's a retired judge of the U.S. Immigration Court for Washington, D.C. and Arlington. She spent close to 25 years on the Immigration Court from 1980 to 2005 and has years of experience handling complex immigration issues. She's past president of the National Association of Women Judges, a native of Washington. She went to Wilson High and then to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Oh, yeah, I knew that. And for both undergraduate and law school. So there. She and her late husband, Tony, are the parents of 7 children, lots of grandchildren. We are going to go through the presentation tonight with the Q&A to follow. So please hold your questions. And with that, I'd like to introduce the Honorable Judge Joan Churchill.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Especially, I'm happy to have classmates from both Wilson High School and Michigan Law School among you. I know why we're all here, but I just want to make sure that you realize at the beginning, I don't have the answers. I don't think anybody has the answers. What I want to do is go over some of what's been going on. Now, you've all been reading the newspaper too, just like I have, and I've gotten most of my information from the newspapers. Jeff wanted me to present this as what's been happening, what's happening now, what's happening in the future. I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future. Every day brings a fresh surprise. So we'll have to just guess at that. But I can compare what's going on now with what went on before. I'm going to start with a couple biblical texts because we are here in a synagogue. I interpret this to mean that the word stranger I consider to be foreigner. It could be translated, I think, as foreigner. So we shall not wrong foreigners or oppress them, because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. And then there's a phrase about widows and orphans, which I think relates to what's going on right now, because people are sort of being turned into virtual widows and orphans from what's going on with the family separations. I threw in the phrase, the passage about from Deuteronomy because it has to do with justice. And my job as an immigration judge was to provide due process to the people in front of us, justice for them. And there's questions about what due process is being promoted or taken away right now. And that's a concern, of course, to me from my judicial perspective. That's this one here. Judge righteously. So that's important that when we enter our judgments that we judge righteously. Okay, I'm going to go a real quick overview of topics. We're not going to be able to cover them all in detail, but there's just so much going on right now. Now, I've been following the newspaper, especially as I was asked to do this presentation. I've been looking at the newspaper even more closely, and I've been clipping a lot of articles. I mean, one day there were 4 different immigration articles at the same issue. So I've put a bunch of them that I clipped on the table if anyone wants to just peruse them a bit. They're not handouts, it's just things that I've been noticing in the paper. Okay, so the topics involving children. There have been there's changes to legal immigration being proposed. Now that's actually quite new. I hadn't heard any proposals to change legal immigration before the current administration. Temporary categories have been terminated. There's focus on what are called sanctuary cities, but there's actually focus not just on cities, but states. In other words, jurisdictions, sub-jurisdictions from the federal government. Border issues are being talked about a lot, and then court issues. I'm going to go into court issues somewhat since my background is related to courts. So I know what's brought most of us out here tonight has to do with family separations, taking children into custody. That is completely unprecedented. Although I just met someone in the audience who told me he'd heard about it going on to some extent under the Obama administration. I'm not aware of that. But some of these things, you don't really know what's going on, and then there's a lot of attention, and we all become more concerned about it. All right, so reunification complexities. Problems about reunifying them. There have been articles about the children in custody are leading regimented lives, described as maybe boarding school versus minimum detention, minimum security type. It depends how you look at it. And then detention of families is sort of an outgrowth of this. We'll get to that. All right, so some of the topics involve children, the family separation, the family reunification. This sort of was an outgrowth of the idea a couple months ago that people entering the United States should be prosecuted criminally, which is a new process. It's in the statute, but that doesn't mean that it's been done. Typically, people who are people who enter without inspection means they sneak in across the border. There haven't been criminal prosecutions for those people generally in the past, unless they were repeat offenders who'd been caught many times. It's a misdemeanor. All right, then we get to detention issues, and also under the category of children has to do with what we call the dreamers, young people who've been in the country a long time, who were brought here by their parents. It wasn't really their own decision to be here. I have a few more slides of our overview here. This one I'm entitling Changes to Legal Immigration. There's been a travel ban proposed, not just proposed, ordered by the president. Two of them all three have been struck down, but the latest one was approved by the Supreme Court just about 3 weeks ago. There's been reduction in refugee numbers. Some of you are involved with the program to welcome a refugee family and adopt one by Washington Hebrew, but no refugee family has been identified for Washington Hebrew. And that's an outgrowth of the fact that refugee numbers have been reduced substantially, and there's this very extensive examination of the people before they come. So it's taking a long time for families to be approved to come. And then there's many congregations all over the country that want to adopt them. So there's somehow no family's been identified so far for Washington Hebrew. Seasonal workers, people like crab pickers, the system for them being admitted to the United States for seasonal work, that's been changed, which has caused a lot of problem for the crab industry and of particular interest in Maryland, but other types of seasonal workers have been affected also. There's been a push to eliminate some of the categories for immigration, such as parents of U.S. citizens, siblings of U.S. citizens, which are in the law currently. And then the administration wants to do away with diversity visas. I don't want to go into much detail now, but we can cover it later if you want to in the conversation. All right, a little more detail about terminating temporary categories. The what's called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and then a later one approved by Obama, which was for parents, Deferred Action for Parents. Those have both been terminated by the current administration. Temporary protected status, which is a status that's been in effect for many years and has covered a number of countries, that's been terminated. That affected El Salvador, Honduras, Sudan, Haiti. Then we have attempts to defund various state and local places. In other words, not allow them to have federal grants that they've been getting if they're not cooperating with immigration enforcement. So far, those attempts have been defeated in the courts. And then there was a lawsuit filed by the current administration against the state of California because the current administration doesn't like a law that California passed. That was struck down, or the case was dismissed by one of the federal courts just a week or so ago. And then there's issues about the border. We've had deployment of military troops, and there's been a lot of negotiating with Congress to try to fund a wall. Can everyone hear me okay? I want to make sure my use of the mic's okay. All right. All right, so this term zero tolerance policy has been used recently, well, you may recall even the day he became president, I think it was in the inaugural address that the president said, anyone who comes here illegally, the moment I become president, they're gone. Didn't he use phraseology like that? I mean, I don't know quite how you can do that. That's not a realistic concept. Migration is something that continues. We have migration going on all over the world. We're very much aware from the news of migration issues in Europe. I mean, just yesterday, I think it was, a boat capsized and a lot of people died in the Mediterranean. And so these issues about migration, they're not just here. They're kind of all over the world. It has to do with culture. It has to do with attitudes, whether people feel willing to accept more people or whether people want fewer people coming from elsewhere. And we're very divided, obviously, both in our own country and in other countries. And this issue is really having a big effect in the politics in Europe, as we see some of the people who are now becoming the leaders of those countries are being challenged. Mrs. Merkel is heavily challenged for her willingness to take a large number of people. And in other countries, nativists are defeating other types of candidates. So the issue about whether we feel that we can accept more people or whether we want fewer people or whether we don't want any more people, it's an issue that, as I say, has people very divided. Zero tolerance is used to describe this idea of bringing criminal prosecution against people who came here without inspection. So a result of that is that families got separated, because if you're sending adults off to criminal detention, their children can't go with them, so the children were being separated, and so then that was reversed. So the president decided, with all the outrage, that he's going to end that policy. But then his substitute for that is to detain the families together, so there's increased detention. And now, in the past, we haven't been detaining people that much. When people arrived with children, they were generally not detained. Under Obama, we all heard about the surge about 3 years ago. There was a supposed surge of a lot of people from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. They're called the Golden Triangle. So Obama, too, engaged in some policies to try to stop that. You may recall there were stories of children largely, but teenagers, maybe young people, riding on the tops of trains and getting killed. It was very dangerous. It became a big humanitarian issue, and President Obama took steps to try to stop that by starting to detain most of these. But he was detaining them as family units, and but there's a court case that says that children can't be detained more than 20 days. This is a court case from 20 years ago. So that court case was invoked, and the Obama administration started releasing the families within the 20-day limit. But they were put in deportation proceedings. Well, now they're called removal proceedings, and question is whether they were evaporating into the woodwork or whether they were actually coming to their hearings. The current administration, when it decided to switch from separating the families to detaining them together, made a motion to the court that issued the Flores decision to ask it to modify its requirement that all children be released within 20 days, but the court declined to make any change to that. So the current administration is bound by this 20-day rule. All right, the travel ban we know about was something that that got imposed, or at least announced within days of inauguration. I've mentioned already termination of DACA, DAPA, and temporary protected status. He reduced the number, President Trump reduced the number of refugees that are allowed legally into the country each year. Under our law, the president has discretion each year to set the number of refugees that can be admitted for the year. Obama in the last year or so increased the number somewhat. I think it had been something like 60,000, and he increased it in his last year of office. He increased it to 115,000, but before they reached that number, Trump was inaugurated, and he's reduced the number to 50,000. So that refugees are legal immigrants. Under our immigration law, people come in various categories. The main categories are family, people with family ties, people with employment offers who are coming in for employment purposes, or refugees. So those are the three main categories. There's a lot of other categories, but those are kind of the main ones. Okay, there have been calls for removal of people who are subject to removal without immigration court hearings. And under the current administration, well, the law has changed over the years. When I started, there was a process called exclusion, where people arriving aliens who did not seem to be qualified for admission under the immigration law, they were put in exclusion proceedings, and they would have hearings scheduled before an immigration judge like me. So I had a number of cases from Dulles Airport, people whose admission was questioned at Dulles Airport. And then some years ago, the Congress changed the law to create something called expedited removal, so that certain categories of people didn't get to go see an immigration judge. They could be just summarily excluded by border officials who found them not qualified for admission. But there was a big caveat on that, a big exception for people who claimed to fear persecution in where they were coming from. And those people were then scheduled for what's called a credible fear interview with an asylum officer. And if the asylum officer found they had a credible fear of persecution, they were then referred to the immigration court for asylum hearings in a due process setting. That's being cut back enormously right now. It used to be that people who entered the United States without inspection, at least in my early days, they all had the right to be have removal here. We call them deportation hearings. To have deportation hearings before an immigration judge. Hearings in immigration court are due process. They're adversarial. There's parties represented, both sides. They don't have to be represented, but the government usually has a government lawyer there. And the judges are impartial, and we make decisions based on the evidence presented. So anyone who had entered without inspection was allowed that type of hearing. They decided that some years ago, Congress changed the law that people who entered without inspection who were caught within 2 weeks within 100 miles of the Mexican and Canadian borders could be summarily excluded without going before an immigration judge. The current administration has changed that to people who entered without inspection caught within 2 years anywhere in the U.S. can be summarily excluded. So that is a big change as far as the opportunity of people to have immigration due process type hearings. And then other things have come up lately. Just about a month or two ago, the Attorney General came out with a decision that peoples cannot be considered to have a credible fear of persecution if what they fear is domestic violence or gang violence back home. Now, those are categories that in recent years have been considered a basis for at least a credible fear. The people making the credible fear evaluations over the past few years have found credible fear for 80% of the people claiming a credible fear. Now, just in the last few days, with this Attorney General ruling and a directive to the asylum officers to find there's no credible fear in those types of cases, far more people are being removed summarily without being referred to immigration court. Okay. So then I've already mentioned the defunding of sanctuary cities, the attempts on that, which is a move by the current administration that's different from anything in the past. All right, so I've divided this a little bit into executive action, congressional action, and judicial action. So I've been telling you so forth about changes in executive action that have taken place under the new administration. So just looking at the congressional branch, there's been quite a bit of activity, but none of the bills have passed, and that's because of deep divisions within society and within the people in Congress. Some people feel things are too strict, other people feel they're not strict enough. I mean, you just take the Dreamers, for example. The polls show that a majority of people in the country want the Dreamers to be given some sort of permanent status in the United States. So this has been talked about for years, and there have been attempts to pass a law that would basically give them amnesty. I'm going to use the word, even though it's considered a dirty word by some people, but basically give them amnesty so they could live in the United States as permanent residents for the rest of their life. Right now, they have no lawful permanent status. Well, some people wanted to, under the current administration, they've added a whole lot of negotiating points. Well, if you want the Dreamers to be given a permanent status, then you have to agree to change the immigration law in a number of drastic ways, such as reducing the number of legal immigrants that can come in, as I said, siblings and parents of U.S. citizens, end diversity, fund the wall. I mean, just a long list of demands in exchange for legalizing the Dreamers. It used to be that the attempt was just to have a bill to legalize the Dreamers without any quid pro quo just for that particular point. So those are and I call part of that comprehensive. I always put reform in quotes because I'm not sure any of these changes that people propose are necessarily reforms. I tend to think that the old way may have been better, the way the law was previously. Changes are not always improvements. Okay, so then turning to the courts, the Supreme Court's been very active lately. It upheld the travel ban June 26, the current travel ban. It's the third attempt, but they found it was constitutional, a constitutional exercise of the president's power, and did not violate the rules law against discrimination against people from particular countries. A case rather interesting to immigration judges, probably not that interesting to many of you, has to do with charging documents. When a person is found to be in the U.S. illegally, they're issued a charging document, which used to be called an order to show cause, which was short for an order to show cause why they should not be deported. There was a change in the immigration law some years ago to change the term from deportation hearings to removal hearings, and the charging document has the title Notice to Appear. So that's the name of the charging document starting the removal proceeding. However, in recent years, many of these, or most of these charging documents have not actually specified a date and time or place to come to a hearing. So like the second line of the document says, you are commanded to come to a hearing about your case on, and the date's been left blank, and the time has been left blank, and the place is left blank. So a case that the Supreme Court decided recently held that those documents that don't specify a time and place to come are not notices to appear. So now there's a big question whether all of those notices to appear are invalid. The specific question before the Supreme Court, which the lawyers in the room will appreciate maybe more than the rest of you, is whether the issuance of these documents started a time bar on being eligible for certain applications for relief. Because under the Immigration Act, if a person's been in the country 10 years illegally, they can apply to stay permanently if they can show that their removal would cause them and their children, mostly children, but certain qualifying relatives, an exceptional and extremely unusual hardship. But it also says that the issuance of a charging document cuts off the 10 years. So if a person gets the charging document within a few days of arrival, they'd never be eligible to apply for this special relief because they have to have had 10 years in the country without having been put in removal proceedings. Well, what the Supreme Court held was that a charging document that doesn't specify the time or date cannot start the 10-year bar. But a lot of the immigration judges around the country have interpreted that to mean that the charging documents are invalid and therefore have been terminating the cases of the people who had those types of charging documents. So anyway, that's a question to be decided later. But, okay. Then there's been a rather important decision a little earlier this year, a couple months ago, that had to do with long-term indefinite detention of people. The Immigration Act, each time it's been amended over the last 30 years or so, the Congress people have made it tougher. They've made it more restrictive because each Congress, they want to say they're being tough on illegal immigrants. So one of the things they did to make it tougher is they created various categories of people that are subject to mandatory detention. So generally, the immigration judges can decide, one of the first things we typically decide when a new case comes before us is whether or not the person can be released on bond. And we decide how much of a flight risk they are and we usually would set a bond amount of a certain amount. The bond has to be posted, and that's to assure that the person will appear at the hearing. Or if the person's a security risk or a risk to public safety, we would hold the person without bond. But those are kind of rare cases. So usually the issue about whether a person's detained or not is whether they're a flight risk. In other words, whether they will appear or not at the removal hearing itself. But with all these categories of mandatory detainees, the judges aren't allowed to consider whether they might be likely to appear and grant them bond. The immigration courts have gotten very backlogged, and currently cases are being scheduled years into the future. So some of these people who are awaiting their hearings are being held for years, and there's been a court challenge that they should at least be allowed to have bond hearings based on another case in the Supreme Court a few years ago, which held that people being detained indefinitely had to have bond hearings at least every 6 months. And those were people who'd already been ordered deported, but the government couldn't find a country willing to receive them. Well, the Supreme Court ruled that it's okay to hold the people indefinitely. I may be stating this over simply. They did remand the case for consideration of the constitutional question, but they said there's nothing, but the statute, the immigration statute allows people to be held indefinitely. So that was a Supreme Court ruling a couple months ago. That case is on remand now to the Ninth Circuit to consider whether there's a constitutional issue about holding people indefinitely. There was a case just April 17 in which the Supreme Court found that some language in the Immigration Act is constitutionally vague and therefore unconstitutional. And that has to do with the term crime of violence, which is a term used for some of these people that are being subject to mandatory detention. And it affects one of the categories that got set up when the law became tougher was aggravated felonies. It turns out aggravated felonies are even include some misdemeanors, which doesn't make too much sense to some of us that are lawyers. Okay, and then there was a case involving the DACA. termination. Some lower courts held that it wasn't valid, and the Supreme Court, the administration asked the Supreme Court to take it immediately and not let it go through the normal appeal process. We have a 3-step federal court system with trial courts, appellate courts, and Supreme Court. And they were asking to skip appellate court review. That is, the administration was asking to skip an appellate court review and go straight to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said no. We're not interested in leapfrog certification of the case. So that case is still in the Ninth Circuit. Okay, then there's cases in other courts, including the one I just mentioned, that's in the Ninth Circuit. There's I mentioned already, the Flores order restricting the length of time that children can be detained. The motion to change the 20 days and lengthen it was denied by that court. And then there's an injunction that was issued June 26, that's just 3 weeks ago, requiring the administration to reunite all the children separated from their parents within a specified time frame. And so as you know, there was a certain deadline set for children under 5, and then another deadline that's, I think, still a couple weeks later from today for children that are 5 to 17. And I know we have a person in the audience from the Health and Human Services Department, which is working on reuniting those children. But it turned out that they are coming up with reasons why some of the children cannot be reunited, such as that they think that the children would not be safe if reunited with the person, with the parents. And also they seem to be excluding ones involving parents that are currently still in detention for the removal hearings or the federal criminal hearings. Now, did you all notice there was an article in the paper a few days ago which had photographs, and I'm talking about the Washington Post, that's the paper I generally read, photographs of children being reunited with their fathers. You see, I saw a picture with 3 different fathers being shown, and my immediate reaction is, why no mothers? I don't know the answer to that, because most of these children came with mothers rather than fathers. My guess is that these fathers were already in the United States. They were not the children. They were not the parent that accompanied the child across the border. But they're in the U.S., they've been located, and the children are being reunited with fathers. See, I think, as I understand it, the government is interpreting the order to mean the children only have to be reunited with a parent, not necessarily with a person that they were separated from at the border. And like one of the articles, the father said, my child didn't recognize me. But I think perhaps the child had not seen that father for a long time, that the father had actually left the child and mother down in the Golden Triangle some years ago. So that's where, sometimes it's hard to know really what the news articles are portraying. So then, more recently, the same judge has issued an order for a 1-week delay on some of the families that have been reunited as to whether they can be deported. Now, I don't know why those families are being deported, but it could be that the parents have been subject to some of these expedited removal orders that I was telling you about. And so then the question is, well, shouldn't they have some chance to decide whether they want to pursue asylum, at least on behalf of the children? And maybe leave, and again, so they would be contemplating staying a separation again if they decide they want the children who are not subject to removal orders to stay here after they're deported, but the children could have their own hearings and perhaps apply for asylum. And I've already talked a little bit about the sanctuary cities issues. The government requested an injunction to prevent enforcement of a California law, but that's been denied. And various states and cities are suing the United States regarding denial of federal grant money, and so far they seem to be successful. April 19, there was a decision in one of the federal courts involving Chicago, which said that it was not proper to deny Chicago federal grant money because of its alleged lack of cooperation with immigration enforcement. All right, then we get to my bailiwick, the immigration courts. Currently, there's a backlog of over 700,000, and it's continuing to increase. Now, this is an overwhelming backlog. I cannot explain why it is going up so dramatically. The date of the inauguration of the current administration, there were about 500 and some thousand cases pending. So why has it gone up over 150,000 just in a year and a half? I mean, I don't know. There are some theories on that. I know the immigration judges feel that part of it has to do with these constant changing of priorities. Like the current administration, as did the Obama administration, said, well, we need to discourage people from coming here and taking these dangerous journeys. So let's make sure they have hearings right away. As soon as they arrive, we'll have hearings. Most of them will be ordered deported, and then fewer people will want to come. You see, I haven't mentioned yet, but a big factor here has to do with the smuggling organizations, which are like travel agencies for the people who want to come to the United States. So they can advertise, if you come, you're likely to be able to stay several years because the backlogs are so long. Or if you bring a child, you're likely to be able to be released and become part of the community for at least several years while your case is pending. So this idea of having fast hearings means that the judges who already have established dockets, cases ready for trial, have to abandon those, put those at the end of the line, and start doing other cases. And things get all mixed up and hectic when you keep changing priorities. So that's one theory of why the backlog keeps increasing. Now, so the Attorney General has recently come out with various orders that the immigration judges are very upset about, and that has to do with performance metrics, telling them that they have to complete at least 700 cases a year to get a satisfactory rating. We didn't used to have ratings at all, at least not ones that, I mean, that's kind of unusual, that judges are rated by the agency in which they work rather than by, let's say, the public at large. But they decided under Gonzalez said there had to be evaluations each year, and the current Attorney General has come up with cases have to be completed within a certain time frame. He doesn't allow continuances, and if your cases are remanded more than a certain percentage, these are all factors taken into account as to whether you are performing satisfactorily. The judges feel this is an interference with due process and judicial independence. Then the Attorney General has done something very unusual. This current Attorney General, he has been certifying certain cases to himself. Under the regulations, it's a quasi-judicial structure with a trial court. That's what I was sitting on, an appellate board called the Board of Immigration Appeals. And then in rare instances, cases have been certified to the Attorney General for review and with him in a quasi-judicial role. These cases that the current Attorney General has been certifying to himself, nobody on either side has requested that they be certified to him or that he review them. The typical track for cases from the Board of Immigration Appeals is that if the alien side is unsatisfied with the decision of the board, they can appeal to the U.S. Courts of Appeals around the country. If the government is unsatisfied with the decision of the Board of Immigration Appeals, it can't appeal because the government cannot appeal itself, and the Board of Immigration Appeals is an agency within the executive branch. Anyway, the Attorney General's been certifying a number of cases to himself that no one asked him to, including docket control mechanisms that the judges have been using for 30 years, such as closing cases administratively that didn't seem to be ripe for adjudication at the moment. That's largely because there was something else pending regarding the person that the immigration judge did not have authority over. But the Attorney General, after inviting briefs and receiving about 14 amicus briefs from people, decided that there's no authority to do that, even though it's been a practice for 30 years. So that is going to increase the backlog, as I mentioned, 700,000. That can increase the backlog by another 100,000 or 200,000 if all the people granted whose temporary protected status has been canceled or put on the docket. That would be another about 200, 300,000 cases. So the cases can go to, the backlog could easily reach 1 million pretty soon. All right, we can cover some of this. It's sort of time for me to finish my presentation. But what I want, we're going to have a conversation in a few minutes. And these are the types of topics that we might want to discuss in our discussion or conversation. Activities of smugglers, prevention of human trafficking. That's one of the concerns that the government has when people come to the border. You see, what the expected way for people to come to the United States is that they have a visa. People, to get a visa, they have to go to the consulate. They're checked out. People who sneak in or people who just arrive at the border haven't been checked in any way. So how do you know that the people bringing these children are actually the parent? So they're, how do you know that they're not traffickers? Unaccompanied minors has been a big problem to deal with in recent years, more so than before. So we have the cost of housing migrants, this idea that, well, if people come, they need to be provided housing in detention centers. There must be a big cost for all this DNA testing which is going on. If people apply abroad, they have to provide birth certificates, documents to prove relationships. People are coming without documents, so the government's doing DNA tests. We have international treaty obligations to respect. We belong to an international protocol on refugees, and we have an obligation to respect that. People seeking asylum at the border, it's considered part of our obligation under our treaty obligations to allow people to apply for asylum at the border. How do we make sure that people come to their hearings? And then there's cultural issues. You know, Trump mentioned just the other day that the culture of Europe is being changed by migration. So it's hard to know what's going on. There seems to be an awful lot going on. Maybe someone in the audience can tell us what's going on at HHS. And then there's this concept of immigration system being broken. That's a phrase that an awful lot of people like to use. I'm not sure it's a correct concept. People mean different things. Some people want immigration stopped. Other people want more immigration. I just make the observation, it's hard to stop migration. There's been migration forever, right? Didn't Abraham leave his hometown and go elsewhere? Obama's attempts, he invited the presidents of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to come to the White House. He talked tough to them. But I don't think it was very effective. He did set up a system of financial aid for those countries. I heard a panel discussion recently that this financial aid program hasn't been working well or the way it was intended. But that's to try to build up what's going on in those countries. And he even came up with a system that people could apply for asylum locally, but that hasn't worked out either. So I feel very strongly that an immigration court that's independent of the Justice Department is essential. and that we should set up, it will require congressional legislation, but a separate immigration court that is not under a political department like the Justice Department is important. So at that point, I open this for questions. You've had a discussion. You've had your hand up a lot. Jeff's going to be coming around with a mic.
Okay,
and you
so
have
raise your
introduced
hand. One
yourself to me.
question.
Go ahead.
Why don't you start since you have to leave?
You don't want the mic? And this is Mr. Sherman. He told me that he's worked at the Justice Department.
I just want to relate my experiences at the Justice Department. I was a career prosecutor during the Obama administration. And, at the outset, let me say that my parents were immigrants, and, I'm all pro-immigrants. I understand their plight. They're in dire straits. They're seeking a better life. But Obama was also tough on immigration. He talked about how illegal immigration displaces working-class Americans, including those in the African-American community, and how they tend to depress wages of working America. But the big issue here, just to try to put it into context, one, in the media, there's a lot of misinformation about conflating legal and illegal. Legally, this country allows more immigrants than any country in the world, up to 1 million people a year. They wait up to 5 years. The problem at the southern border, it is very porous. It's estimated about 1,000 people, if you will, as you put it, sneak across the border illegally. The Obama administration, when this upsurge occurred, they did try to prosecute some of them, the repeat offenders, and he did separate them, because anytime you have a criminal prosecution, you're going to separate them. But there was an uproar and protest from the pro-immigrant Hispanic community. He decided to release them. He adopted this plan referred to as catch and release, as you referred to. They released him with hearing dates way in the future. And now, these are the people, there's two ways you come into the country to seek asylum. One, you do it legally by the port of entry, and that's not illegally. We're talking about people who sneak across, they get caught, and it's sort of like their backup plan is to assert asylum. So when they were released with their families, I had colleagues who tell me that reported up to 40% would not come back to the court hearing, and that shouldn't be any surprise, because they were willing to sneak across in the first place and live in this country, and so basically you're giving them another chance to allow the state to live in the country. And as anyone who's in law enforcement or a judge would know, that if you enforce the law, people obey the law. And so when these people would not return to the court, the smugglers and everything, word got out that there was basically this called, if you will, a loophole. They gained the system. You bring some kids with you, whether or not they're your kids or not, you'll get released into the country even if you're caught. Right, well, you want a discussion. So that encouraged, when you don't enforce the law, that encouraged more illegal immigration. Trump came in, he announced this program, what he referred to as zero tolerance. And that is, as you pointed, now you can go two ways: removal proceedings where you simply deport them, or prosecute them for misdemeanors or a 6-month sentence. That's what he did. Obviously, there was an uproar. It's far too harsh to try to separate little kids. And so that's the problem. You got people coming across a porous border, and there's so many of them coming at 1,000 a day. If you release them, they don't come back for the hearings, because these hearings are set in the long future, and they were coming in here with families. What are you going to do? Prosecute them? So that's the issue.
You've raised a number of points I want to follow up on. One is about, I didn't go over the criteria for asylum. The Refugee Act, our Refugee Act was passed in 1980, and we adopted the UN Convention's definition, and a person is considered a refugee if they have a fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. These categories have been expanded by interpretation, and there have been a lot of work in recent years by advocates to consider the people who fear domestic violence and fear other types of harm fit within those categories. The immigration, the term refugee, to most of us, when we're using it casually, means any type of harm that might be going on, such as violence, lawlessness, criminal activity, going on in the country. So whether those concepts fit the definition of being afraid on account of a particular social group has become the subject of a lot of debate and contention. Now, our country adopted the concept of temporary protected status, which expands people that we protect. So people that are considered not to fit the definition of refugee have been allowed for many years to stay in this country under temporary protected status, which has been renewed periodically for these countries. It's just been canceled from almost all of them. But temporary protected status has been allowed for people from countries that have had natural disasters, such as hurricanes, floods, or violent conditions. And then the people have been here a long time. So like the people from El Salvador have had temporary protected status for probably about 15 years or so. So over time, they've developed all kinds of ties to our community. Also, the government of El Salvador likes the remittances that they send back. So the government of El Salvador has been pushing our country, each time it's time for renewal, to renew it so that the people can continue to stay and continue to contribute through remittances to the economy back home. And we here in the Washington area have a large number of people from El Salvador. I wanted to make a couple other points. Currently, the apprehension rate of people entering the U.S. illegally is at its lowest rate for many, many years. So the concept that we're having a huge influx of people entering illegally does not accord with the statistical facts. The surge that occurred 3 years ago from these countries was largely of children. Some of them were accompanied and some were unaccompanied, but it got the attention of the press at the time. Now, the Obama administration was heavily criticized by many immigrant advocacy groups for deporting as many people as it did. And under Obama, there was a larger number of people actually removed than had been removed for a long time. So he felt he was being tough on immigration. He was trying to show the people who were arguing that, we're not being tough enough, that we are being tough at the same time trying to come up with an immigration reform. You may recall that an comprehensive immigration bill passed the Senate. It was bipartisan, and it passed by more than 60 votes, but the House never took it up. So that definition I gave you of a refugee applies both to people getting refugee visas in other countries, like I think our Cantor Manovich got, and Emma, I think they came in on refugee visas. And it applies, so the same definition applies to people seeking asylum in the U.S. Okay, over here. Is there someone? Yes?
What are the requirements for due process in an immigration court?
Well, due process means that the decision has to be based on the evidence presented. It means that the judge is neutral, that the judge's decision is independent, based only on the evidence presented. There can be no ex parte communication from either side, and there's supposed to be no influence from the agency.
And what about representation by attorneys?
Yes, everyone in a deportation, in a case before an immigration judge, is entitled to a lawyer, but not at government expense. So that's different from our criminal proceedings. So there's a lot of groups out there that provide pro bono attorneys, but it's hard to find enough to cover, to Daniel?
No, we have a question.
No, Daniel, yes?
Yes.
Keith.
Are the refugees involved in this difficult situation, do they have a basic advantage over those who...
I didn't catch the beginning of what you said. Are refugees what?
No, no, I want to compare refugees between Africa and Europe on one hand, and refugees between Central and South America and the US. One thing that strikes my mind, the drownings.
The what?
There are no drownings in America.
There's no what?
No drownings, no deaths.
Drowning?
No
That's
death
right,
in
yeah.
waters.
No death in the water, but there's death in the desert. What's the point you're making?
The people, tens of thousands die in the Mediterranean Sea, and you cited an example, whereas I believe here it's almost zero drowning, zero.
Oh, that's correct. People are not drowning in the
So
Rio
am
Grande.
I correct to notice this major difference between what takes place in Europe and Africa and here? Here they can...
Of course, the drowning in the Mediterranean, yeah, that's between Africa and Europe. And people, again, that's being driven by smuggling organizations. The people are paying huge sums of money to the smuggling organizations to bring them in these rubber raft boats on dangerous journeys across the Mediterranean. But there has been a lot of criticism that as our border enforcement got tougher, and it has gotten tougher over the years, more fencing and more apprehensions and so forth, people coming to the U.S. have been seeking riskier routes to come here, and there have been deaths, a lot of deaths in the desert.
Joan, I have a question based on your experience, please. As a journalist, I'm concerned that journalists and even senators have not been allowed into the detention centers holding children, so that we're getting very piecemeal reports of what it's like. In your experience, were journalists allowed before to see the detention centers or the digs in which they put these families waiting for hearings?
Well, I don't really know the answer to that. I don't think there's been as much detention in the past. You see, typically people have not been detained, which is different than Europe. In Europe, the large numbers of migrants are pretty much always put in camps. Here, the tradition has been that there would be bond hearings and people would be released. And, we have this special problem now that the backlog's gotten so great. President Trump has been quoted as saying he doesn't want people going before judges. He doesn't want more immigration judges. He doesn't want them going before judges. He just wants them not to come. Whereas Senator Cruz is saying he wants to double the number of judges on the immigration court so we can have more judges in order to deal with the cases without such long backlogs. But the cases get complicated, and if they're going to be given due process, you have to give people a chance to present all their evidence and their witnesses. They need time to gather their evidence and so forth. As far as you can understand the other side of it as to why these centers do not want huge numbers of people coming in to visit. Because they're dealing with children, this would be very disruptive to constantly have visitors coming in. And I think they cite privacy concerns for the children also. They feel, and I'm pretty sure, where's Frank from HHS? I think HHS feels that it's being showing care toward the children and taking care of these children that have been put in their custody. And, and then you see these articles about, well, the children aren't allowed to touch each other. But then you can understand why rules like that would be. Where do you draw the line whether touching is offensive or not offensive? So they obviously have created these blanket rules, no touching. And I think in our schools, the children are told not to touch each other, right? So on the one hand, it sounds inhumane, but on the other hand, it's designed to be protective. The whole immigration issue has to do with how to balance being humane, showing humanity, and compassion, and at the same time not fostering human trafficking, not fostering terrorism. You know, there's talk about, well, those people are just open border types. But nobody, I think in this country, there's nobody that's really in favor of open borders, meaning no controls. I think we all have concern about protecting our country from terrorists and so forth. Yeah, okay.
I have a very different question. What about, can you comment about the St. Louis,
Could you put it like
the
this?
St. Louis boat that came, St. Louis, that
what
came here in
about
the
it?
1940s?
What
It was a
about it?
ship that came here
Yes,
from
right,
Germany.
In 1938, I think that was.
And they were not allowed to come. They were sent to Cuba or maybe back to Europe anyway. So,
I'll tell you what I know about that,
Yeah.
which I've read about. That was before I was born, not to mention it was before I became an immigration judge. But the St. Louis involved people who, this was before World War II broke out. And the people on the St. Louis, the ship was sort of a luxury liner at the time. They all had visas for Cuba. And while the ship was en route to Cuba, because of its own internal political issues, canceled all the visas. So when the ship arrived in Cuba, the people were not allowed to land and their visas were not respected. Now, I don't know if you've read the book by Leslie Maitland, who's a member of our congregation, but she has written a very interesting book about her own family's experiences when they got on a boat for Cuba some years later. And they too suffered the issue of a cancellation of their visas, but in their case, somehow that was turned around and her family was able to migrate to Cuba. But so the Cuban government refused the entry. And then the Jewish, I think it was called the Jewish Distribution.
Joint distribution.
Yeah, there was an organization in the United States. Well, I don't know, it's just in the U.S. This may have been an international organization to help Jewish people, got very active and pushed very hard for the U.S. government to accept the people. And the ship did come, I understand, within view of Miami, but was not allowed to land. Now, these people had no visas for the U.S. And then the Canadian government was approached, and it too refused to let the people land in Canada. And then the distribution, what's it called, Marcia? The joint worked out with countries in Europe that were not allied with Germany at the time. And they felt they had achieved a success in obtaining agreement by Britain, France, I think the other two were Belgium and Holland, to accept the people from the St. Louis. So they were taken, the ship sailed back to Europe, and the people went sort of a quarter to each of those countries. Very moving book that I read by a man whose father was one of those on the St. Louis. Forgetting the name of it, I think he spoke here, in which he talked about how his father went to France. But in the end, his father perished. The people who went to Britain and the people who went to Britain did not perish. And the other three countries, some of them perished and some of them managed to get out. But all of this happened before World War II even broke out. But you were dealing with some very anti-immigrant attitudes in the United States at the time. And we all think about what a tragedy that was and how things should have been different and they should have been allowed in. It was so sad. Yeah. Oh, not that.
Excuse me, when there are no visas in this, when there are no visas in these tragic situations, who cares? Who needs the visas in times of war when there are kids and pregnant women? Who has invented this idea of a visa?
Right.
Who cares about visas? Mm-hmm. This is my question.
Well, there's no answer to that. Some people do and some people don't, Daniel.
Visa.
Okay. Okay.
Any other questions we want to share? Frank?
Comment? Frank's getting the mic.
No. Thanks.
I'm Franklin Marks. I work for the Department of Health and Human Services. I've been there for a long time. I'm not personally involved in this program, but I know a number of people who are. And they've hustled when the president changed his mind and said children and parents should be reunited. And they've done what they can to get children and parents reunited. And I think a lot of the vast majority of the easy cases they've been able to do that with in the last 2 or 3 weeks. I know people in those offices. But there are problems in other instances. They have found out that a number of the mothers who came across the border and were separated from the children have since been deported, and they're not even here anymore. So they have to figure out how to reunite people like that. Here and there, they've also found bogus situations where the people coming across the border were not the real parents, and they're not so sure they want to reunite them like that. So they're trying to figure out what to do in the next step. And I must say there have been stories just the last few days about what it was like for the children who have been kept in a couple of these detention areas in Texas, where the people who are hired to do daycare work for them, in some cases were rather strict and kind of semi-threatening them just to behave themselves. Nothing terrible, but pretty strict, and you have to wonder if they did a good job or not. It's an ongoing effort, and people are working on that. Something that caught the eye of a lot of people was something that Joan mentioned, that Senator Cruz from Texas has proposed creating many new judgeships, just like Joan. Maybe they'll pull you out of retirement, who knows, and send them down to the Texas area or other parts of the South, Arizona, maybe Florida, to try somehow to start to deal with all these folks on a speedier basis. You mentioned there's, what, 600,000 or 700,000 backlog cases?
There was over 700,000 at the last count, which is a month or two
And
ago.
you
I
have
think
to-
it was 714,000 as of May.
You have to try to figure out how to deal with that somehow. So we have people working on these things all the time, and that's how things are. I'd like to see that idea come to fruition, have many new judgeships for immigration created down there and try to go through this process. I don't know if that idea got anywhere, although Senator Cruz proposed
Well, they're
it.
working on it. I think it's
All right,
pending.
I'll give this back to you.
I wanted to mention about deporting the parents while the children are here is part of what's so outrageous, especially with this order that they're supposed to be reunited. There's been an awful lot of mix-up about just bureaucracy as far as matching the children after they were taken away. The children are actually being turned into unaccompanied minors, and unaccompanied minors under our act have their own special rights to be able to apply for permanent residence under a special provision in the act called Special Immigrant Juvenile. So in addition to families and employees and refugees, one of the additional categories are special immigrant juveniles, which are children who've been abandoned and are in the United States without parents. Now, so it seems to me for a country that supposedly doesn't, or administration that doesn't want the children here, but they're kind of creating an avenue for them to be able to stay permanently by separating them like that.
And I had one question, if I could. There was another one over there, since I have a microphone.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Okay. It just seems, as someone who's not really that knowledgeable, it just seemed like a lot of this could have been foreseen by the government, by a variety of agencies, and that, of course, once you get the children, once you separate the children, I mean, where are the name tags? Where are the basics of just tracking, for God's sakes?
Exactly.
That it's a self-inflicted problem in a lot of ways, and at the end of the day, you look at government and you say, how incompetent. So
Exactly.
it's very frustrating because we did it. It could have been done a week or 2 or 4 or 6 later without any difference, and with some semblance of organization and skill and thought. And And now it's just now recovering is impossible. Is almost impossible. A lot of these kids.
For the ones who've been deported, the only way I can see that being solved is to bring the parents back. And that sort of thing has been done on occasion. A lot of the parents say they were sort of pressured to say that they would agree to be removed or deported, and that the children would be reunited with them before they left. But once they got to the airport, they were just removed and no children were there. So that's just unconscionable.
Hi, my name is Janie Bear, and I learn a lot by analogy. So my father, who's no longer alive, came from Germany before the war. His parents were sponsored, and they came here, I think Minnesota or something. My father had to go on a
Transport? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
To England? Or?
He was in England, and he didn't know who he was staying with, and I think he went from person to person. So explain to me the differences of...
Well, that has to do with mental attitude, right? These children are being forcibly removed from their parents. The parents have not agreed to send them on a kinder transport anyplace. You know, whether they're being nicely cared for or not. I assume that the people who are caring for them are very well-meaning and are trying to, give them good care. One story I heard was a child being reunited with his parent said no, he wanted to stay with the foster parent. That sort of thing's inevitable in these situations. But when you think about separation, family separation, a lot of these families have already been separated. As I alluded to, maybe someone in the family already left for the U.S. sometime in the past, leaving the mother and child or children behind. So now they want to join. That's how many of us, our own parents, grandparents, whatever, came to America in pieces, right? Although they came legally. We didn't have the same kind of restrictions. Currently, we're talking about people coming here with no documents who have not been vetted in any way. They're just coming. And I think this order about reuniting children may only relate to reuniting them with their parents, not necessarily to reuniting them with the people who brought them across the border from whom they were separated. There's a case on I watched the NewsHour, and they're following an individual case of a woman who came across the border with her grandchild. And they periodically have an update on this story every few days on the NewsHour. Well, they were separated, even though the NewsHour actually crossed the border with them with cameras and all. But they were separated because it was the grandmother, not the mother, not the father.
Last question, okay?
Joan, when a kid is 3 years old and 4 years old and the mother has been deported, how does the kid make a case to stay in America, and with whom does this child stay? And are we kidnapping these kids?
Well, you could view it that way. And there was a story in the paper the other day about one of my former colleagues presented with us. It mentioned he had a 1-year-old in front of him. And that he was quoted as saying, like, I'm embarrassed. There's no way to explain to this child what's going on, a 1-year-old child. So you have to, exactly, the court? With a 1-year-old child who's in custody of the federal government? Presumably one does what one can to get the child counsel, an attorney. The child is, now that's where it's unclear what's going on, but the government is trying to find, for all of these children, is trying to find family ties within the U.S., whether it might not be parents, but it might be, most of the people coming here have some family ties in the U.S. That's why they're coming to the U.S. rather than going to other countries. Well, there really isn't any answer. Well, not the immigration court. I wanted to say jurisdiction. The immigration court has jurisdiction to decide about the child's immigration status, but they don't have any jurisdiction about the custody of the child. The states can set up arrangements for the child to be under state custody and perhaps find foster families or something like that. But it just seems like quite an, as I said, completely unprecedented situation. Okay.
And with that, we have to conclude this evening. Joan, I want to Judge Joan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you. Clearly, there are not a lot of answers and more questions anyway. But anyway, thank you for coming. You all are fortunate to be on our email list, and you'll get an announcement. We have a couple of more of these programs in the works on a variety of subjects, so I'm glad you came out. Thank you for coming, and we will see you next time at Inside the Issues.